In this video, I'm going to walk through the process of creating a custom control. And I'm going to actually add a quadrant style gauge and a numeric gauge to DataHub WebView. And I'm going to show you a little bit about how the architecture of DataHub WebView supports third-party controls. I'm also going to discuss briefly how we can use some very advanced functionality intended for developers to access programmatic interfaces that are exposed by the application for some very advanced functionality. I'm going to start by reviewing the circular gauges demo page, and you'll recall that we've been on here several times, and of course we can change the set point in the gauges update. But these controls, in particular the 3-indicator radio gauge and the simple radio gauge, are actually custom controls that we sourced from a company called Telerik. And Telerik made available the RAD gauge, and what we did was added the appropriate XAML and XML, and we're then able to include it in the release of DataHub WebView version 1.1. So I'm just going to very quickly start by exiting to design mode and illustrating that down here in the toolbar we have the simple radio gauge, the 3-indicator radio gauge, and the thermometer, which we probably haven't talked much about yet. But again, those are all examples of a radio gauge. Now, the one thing that is important to note here is that we've been running off of our cloud server, our demonstration cloud server, but I now need to add some custom controls to the server. So I'm going to do this off of localhost, not off a the cloud server. So if you do want to follow along here, you'll need to use either localhost or a test server in your environment. Okay, so to start with, let me just minimize this for a second. To start with, there is a folder that you can access through the download site, the Cogent download site, where on the same page as these videos. And you'll see in this folder, I've got a couple different pieces of XAML and XML. And I'm going to start by opening up the Telerik quadrant gauge.xaml and Telerik quadrant gauge.xml files. And I'll open those up inside Notepad++. And we're going to start with the XAML once this opens up. I'm now inside my XAML, and this XAML I have copied almost verbatim from the Telerik website, and you can see that this file actually includes the link that I used to source this XAML. And I'm going to just jump there very quickly. Let me just go to a blank Internet Explorer page, and I'll paste that link there, and you can see that it is a online help article from the Telerik company that illustrates how you can build a quadrant style gauge. And right in the help article itself, you'll see that it has the XAML that you can use. And I basically just copy and pasted this directly into the file. And if you want more information on Telerik's controls, I encourage you to go exploring. There are a number of very good quality controls available. As I indicated earlier, the RAD gauge was made available as a free download, and we used that in DataHub WebView version 1.1. And there's some examples of what those gauges look like, and extensive information and extensive help available as well. So I'm going to minimize that window, and I'm back to my XAML. So this XAML, without explaining a lot of it, you can see it creates a radio gauge, and it creates an indicator list, and it has a needle inside that indicator list. And so that's going to simply create a radio gauge. Well, in order to take advantage of this, I also need an XML file. So remember that the XAML really provides the appearance and the layout of the control, but I still need to let DataHub WebView know that this control actually exists. So the architecture of controls is a XAML file and a corresponding XML file that describes the category that the control belongs to, the ID of the control, its file name, which is the XAML file, a description, etc., and then all of the categories of parameters and parameters that describe or define the behavior of the control. So in the XML file, I'm just going to give this control a name. So I'm going to call it quadrant gauge. And I'll give it a name over here as well of quadrant gauge, and I can put a space in there because that's the user-friendly name. The control file name is actually this. So I'm going to type Telerik quadrant gauge dot XAML, and of course I can specify the description, a quadrant gauge, for example. So that's enough information to define the gauge for the toolbar purposes, but I still need to indicate what properties this gauge supports. And so you'll notice that I've got an XML structure here that allows me to define that parameter. So I'm going to just take the XML comments off here, and I'm going to define a single property, which is called value, and its default value is 0, and it needs to bind to something in the XAML. And that's really what the target path attribute is for. Well, if I go back and I have a look at the XAML, you'll see that what I really want to bind the value to is the value of the needle. So somehow I need to indicate that this parameter maps to this needle. And the way I do that is by adding a attribute that belongs to DataHub WebView. So I'm going to add a live, let's spell it correctly, dynamic element dot ID. This is actually an attached property, and I'm going to give it the name needle. This namespace live needs to be defined, and you can see that in fact whenever you're defining custom controls for DataHub WebView, you need to add 2 additional namespaces to the XAML file. So I've just moved those outside the comment there. I'll delete that comment block. I've got the live namespace with a very specific assembly reference, and a WebView or WV namespace, and again with a very specific assembly reference. These assemblies are made available and are part of the DataHub WebView application and exist in the ZAP file, the XAP file. So the key here is in defining the dynamic element.id attached property with a name or an ID that I want to be able to use to reference in my XML. So I'm going to save that file, and I'm going to navigate back here to the Telerik quadrant gauge.xml file. And now what I can do is refer to that dynamic element ID here. And so the value of the needle will really point back to the value of the needle inside the XAML file. And I'm going to save this, and I'm going to minimize. So these 2 files that I have now just edited are ready to be copied onto the server. So I'm going to copy those 2 files, and I'm going to navigate to my web server. And those need to be deployed inside the controls folder. Now they can be deployed anywhere I want, so I'm actually going to add, just to keep things separate a little bit, I'm going to add a custom folder, and inside this custom folder I'm going to paste those 2 files, and there they are there. Now the other thing that is important is to understand, let me just go back to my XAML here for a second, is to understand that the XAML in and of itself simply is relying upon the underlying control that's made available by the control provider, which in this case is Telerik. So when I see things like the Telerik rad gauge, that's referring to this XML namespace here, and so I still need an underlying DLL or an underlying assembly for that control, and that's why I have this folder here called control assemblies. Control assemblies is where we place the DLL files for the controls that we use inside DataHub WebView. And you can see that right now there are two different folders. I have a Cogent folder, which contains the DLLs that are primarily the core controls for DataHub WebView. And you can also see that I have downloaded the Telerik rad gauge control and the DLLs that it requires, and I have simply deployed them into this folder. So if you were going to build your own custom controls and perhaps either source those by buying a third-party control from a vendor like Telerik, or if you wanted to build your own controls using something like visualstudio.net, and you would then deploy the DLL in the control assemblies hierarchy. So I'm now going to minimize that, and I'm going to navigate back to the Cogent Data Hub that is running off my local host. And you'll notice that right now this group of 3 controls represent the group of tutorial controls, and there are only 3 there because those are the ones that were shipped with DataHub WebView. But if I actually in design mode choose Tools, Diagnostics, and Refresh Application Objects, and I'll give it a second here, you should see down here at the bottom of the screen, if this is working correctly, there it is, you'll see that the quadrant gauge has now been found, and the XML and the XAML has been loaded. I should now be able to click once and create an instance of that control, and sure enough, there's the XAML rendered, and you can see the one property that's been made available is value, in addition of course to the common properties, and I should be able to bind that. So if I now choose point and I enter PV and I specify PV, you can see immediately my gauge is now reflecting the value associated with the process variable. So that's all working really nicely. I'm going to do this again really quickly with one other control. I'm going to open up the numeric gauge control. So I'm going to open that into Notepad, and I'm going to basically do the same thing that I just did, but just as another example. So I'm going to take my 2 namespaces, move those up into the user control, and I'm going to, for the purposes of this demonstration, going to add a background gradient to the numeric scale. And again, the source for this XAML is coming directly from the Telerik website, and you can see that they've got an article here on how to create a numeric gauge. In this case, I've already added dynamic element IDs to the gradient stops for this linear gradient brush. I've also done the same thing for the numeric indicator. And so this numeric indicator is a 1, 2, 3, 6 position numeric indicator. Let me save that file, and let me also navigate to the XML file, and again you'll notice that I need to add a little bit of information here. So I'm going to specify that this is a numeric gauge, and I will indicate that the XAML Telerik numeric gauge.xaml, there we go. And of course I can again enter a description or whatever I want. So I've added the identifying information, and now I'm going to specify some parameters. And in this case, I'm going to put parameters in 3 different categories. I'm going to have a few basic properties, and I'm just going to uncomment this code. And so I've got 2 different properties for basic behavior, one that is going to be bound to the numeric indicator, and you'll remember that numeric indicator here, if I go back to the XAML, that is referring to the attached property of dynamic element.id. There's the numeric indicator. So let me go back to that. So I'm going to specify a value and a format, and down in the category entitled background properties, I'm going to reference those gradient stops, and I'm also going to expose a couple font properties that again are related to the numeric indicator. So again, if this is working correctly, I should be able to save those files, and I'll minimize that, and I'm going to grab those 2 files, copy them, go back to my deployment, and there's my custom folder with my controls. I'll paste the numeric gauge controls in there. And here they are. And I should now be able to go back to Cogent Data Hub again. And if I once again choose Tools, Diagnostics, Refresh, and by the way, I don't need to choose Refresh Application Objects. Obviously, the next time the application starts up, it's going to look for those new files anyway, but this is just a little bit more convenient to be able to do it without having to restart the application. So again, if this is working correctly, it should reload all of our control files, and this time it should find the numeric gauge in addition to the quadrant gauge that we just added. And there we go, there's our numeric gauge, and I should be able to click on that. There's my gauge, and I've got my values, and so I should again be able to bind that to something like PV. I should be able to control the format of this, so maybe I want 3 decimal places. I'll just change that to a 3. You'll notice that I have also chosen to expose background and font properties, and I can now play with that. So if I change my Arial to say Georgia, you can see I get a serif font. Of course, I can change the color of my font, and I can change the background color of my gauge. So there's an example of how to very easily add third-party controls to DataHub WebView. In this case, with no development effort, because we've actually sourced those controls from a third-party control vendor. We simply needed to add the XAML file to describe the appearance and layout of the control, and then the XML file to describe the properties that we want to bind to. The final piece of functionality that is available when working with custom controls is something called programmatic interfaces. And this is a very advanced topic, and I'm not going to go into this here. Well, there's another video that covers this. But programmatic interfaces would allow the developer who's building the DLL, who's writing the code in VB.NET or C#.NET, to access or receive notification of various events that occur within DataHub WebView. And I'm going to give you an example of this by using the group control as an example here. So if I just group those controls, you'll notice that I end up with a design time border around those controls. Well, if I go into run mode, that design time border is not there. The important thing to understand is it's not actually DataHub WebView that's drawing that border. The group control itself is responsible for exposing a property that would allow me to show the design time border, and it draws the border itself. But when I go into run mode, the group needs to know whether or not to draw that border. And the only way it knows that it's gone into run mode is if DataHub WebView notifies the control that that's exactly what's happened. And so there is a programmatic interface defined within DataHub WebView called iHostAware, and the custom controls can then implement that interface and receive notification of that event. And there are several different interfaces that are exposed or defined within DataHub WebView, and again, that's beyond the scope of this video.